Okay. There. Signs on our video. Share application. Okay, Kira, can you see that okay on the screen? Yeah, perfect. Okay, everyone, well, it's 1 o'clock, and so we're going to kick off our QI Talk 10 session for today. Thanks to those who have joined. I know that many of you are just coming back after the Easter break, so thanks a million for joining into our 6th in a series of WebExes to try and spread the word about quality improvement around across the country. So today we have Mr. David Smith with us. He's going to be talking to us on how can you use complex adaptive system model in advancing quality improvements in your workplace. So I'm delighted to have David with us today. David is a consultant ENT surgeon and clinical director for perioperative services in Universal Hospital Waterford. He's a graduate of RCSI and trained in Dublin and Belgium and worked as a consultant in the UK before taking up his role in Waterford in 2001. He's clinical director there and also doing a lot of work in the area of quality improvement at the moment in Waterford. He's executive lead for the TPOC program and is co-leading on quality improvement strategic development within Waterford Hospital. So before we get started, just a few quick tips on a successful WebEx. So some of you might have dialed in using the phone. Often the sound is better actually if you do that, but otherwise you can listen to it across audio broadcast on your computer. The top right-hand corner, there's a chat box function. If you click on that, it will enable you to type in any comments or queries or questions that you have throughout David's talk. I'll be fielding those, and we will have time at the end for questions and answers. So if you have anything at all that you want to ask, please do type it into the chat box function. So the talk will finish around 20 to 1:45, and we'll have time then for questions at the end. Please email me, and you'll get my email address at the end of the slides if you want attendance certs. And also we have an active Twitter account, so please do follow us at QI Talk Time. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to David to get going on his talk. Thanks a million.
Thank you, Roisin. Thank you for inviting me to talk this afternoon, and thank you to everybody for listening. The title of my talk, as advertised, was How Can You Use Complex Adaptive System Model in Advancing Quality Improvement in Your Workplace, which is a slight modification, I suppose, in the talk that I had originally submitted. And this particular title suggests that I might be an expert on complex adaptive systems or even on quality improvement, and humility would prevent me from claiming to be either. My original topic or title was Complex Adaptive Systems as a Useful Model for Organizational Change. And I suppose this is a topic that demonstrates my nerdy side. So Roisin already alluded to a little bit about my background. I've been an ENT surgeon in Waterford for about 16 years, so I'm fairly familiar with the way a large organization within the Irish Health Service works. I also spent most of my training in various Irish hospitals. I took on the role of Clinical Director for Perioperative Services in 2015, largely because I had an interest in maybe trying to influence what was going on in the hospital, particularly around quality improvement. As a result of that, I managed to link up with the National Clinical Programs for Surgery and Anesthesia so that Waterford could become a TPOC focus site in 2016, and we're doing ongoing work with that. And in an attempt to build sustainability into the TPOC piece, I've been trying to do some work lately on a QI strategy in Waterford. So as I said, I'm not really an expert. I wouldn't claim to be an expert, but I suppose I am a bit of a curator of ideas. And certainly complexity is something that I've taken an interest in recent years. I suppose my interest in complexity arose out of an online lecture from a biologist called Robert Sapolsky, and even though a lot of the ideas in complexity are quite intuitive, I hadn't really thought about it as a discipline before that. So I suppose as a result of that, I am a little bit of a complexity evangelist. I suppose I'm also a wannabe theoretician in terms of I do a lot of thinking about complexity, and I suppose I'm trying to implement my own theories with regards to working in my own workplace. And then I suppose some of the work we've been doing in Waterford on quality improvement is using this complexity. So I suppose I'm a bit of a neophyte experimentalist. So the purpose of the talk today is really to introduce complexity to people. I'm making an assumption that some people may have an awareness of it, but others will not. To discuss systems thinking, to specifically discuss complex adaptive systems, to talk about healthcare organizations as complex adaptive systems, and just some of the principles of harnessing complexity for quality improvement. So complexity is sort of derived from Latin, and there's a number of different definitions, but essentially if you look at its origin, com means with together, and plectere to weave and braid or entwine. So complexity really revolves around weaving, braiding, and entwining a number of factors together. Complexity, though, really, from the point of view of this talk, it's a paradigm or a worldview, and it's an interesting worldview once you start to explore it. This is a quote taken from a book by Bolton et al. And if you take on board what it means to say the word is complex, this will change the way you think, feel, and act. Now, worldviews are essentially models, and the models with which we represent reality. And using those models, then we can try and predict what might happen within that reality, and also try and explain what happens within that reality. And ultimately, science is about developing and testing models. And good models are testable and predictive. There have been all kinds of worldviews over the years. Some have been more robust than others. Even creationism is a worldview, not necessarily one which many people would agree with, but it is still a worldview. However, essentially all models are wrong and some are useful. This was a quote from George Box. So really, any of our models, any of our worldviews are, philosophically speaking, just representations of reality and not necessarily a true reflection of that reality. But the better paradigms and the better worldviews and more scientific worldviews have their use. The particular worldview which has probably dominated most of Western thinking since the 17th century is the mechanical worldview, and it still pervades a lot of modern thought. And this really arose with the work of Galileo and was built on by Isaac Newton, and then was further elaborated on by Pierre-Simon Laplace, who famously said that in a mechanical worldview, if you had a demon who knew what every particle in the universe was doing, then you could predict into infinity what was likely to happen. Now, the Clockwork Universe is a concept which has come out of that mechanical worldview, and it essentially really has dominated scientific thinking for a number of years. And it essentially is a materialistic and a reductionist paradigm in which you can reduce the universe down into different elements, and that there's a direct cause and effect interaction between those elements. And this is a so-called linear interaction. And I'll talk a little bit about linearity and non-linearity later, because it's a major element of complex systems. So as a result of this linear systems theory, as I said, has dominated the worldview for a number of years. As I said, it's reductionistic. It's about cause and effect based on physical laws. And it is based on something known as the homogeneity principle, in which the output is proportional to the input. And this is one of the two elements of defining a linear system mathematically and otherwise. So just to kind of define this, because I think this is really important in terms of understanding complex systems. So a linear point of view would say that if you had element A, then it will act on element B. It will have a direct cause and effect on element B, which is controlled by a physical law. And then B will have a direct cause effect on C. So that if C happens, you know that B has happened, and if B happens, you know that A has happened. Linearity means that if you double the input at A, then you will get 2B and 2C. So basically, there's a direct relationship. The output is directly proportional to the input. And as I said, I'll talk a little bit more about the relevance to that, to complex adaptive systems, or where it breaks down in complex adaptive systems. So this mechanical paradigm allows the use of standard mathematics to model, and it involves looking at the interaction between a small number of variables, and it assumes closed and static systems. Now, this mechanical worldview actually still pervades the world of management in many areas today, and an assumption that management is based on a control and command in which decisions or actions are predictable and are linear, so that you will get a direct cause and effect based on the decisions taken within management. Following on from Newton's early work, there was further development in the 18th and 19th centuries, looking at multiple particles and systems which had multiple particles. And this utilized statistics and probability. However, this is dependent on the fact that all the interacting variables or particles are independent of each other. And this is a core requirement for the use of the normal distribution or the Gaussian distribution as a way of interpreting that. And this allowed the use of averages. So when you have multiple particles, you could come up with an average figure and use that to make predictions about the particles. Now, these paradigms have been used for social systems for a number of years, and as I said, still pervade modern management thought. However, in 1887, part of this idea started to break down. Henri Poincaré, in an attempt to try and figure out a problem called the three-body problem, found that some elements of the universe are not necessarily deterministic in the way that it was assumed. And this led the framework of chaos theory. And I'll talk a little bit about chaos theory later on. In the 20th century, then, things started to change, and Warren Weaver, who was an American physicist in 1948, in this very interesting paper called Science and Complexity, basically ascertained that up until 1900, science and the world was working on problems of simplicity. In the late part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, the main areas of practice were in the problems of disorganized complexity. And this is based on this concept of averages and of normal distributions. However, in the latter part of the 20th century, there was a change in paradigm and an understanding that, in fact, many scientific problems and social problems were based on organized complexity. This work was further elaborated on by Edward Lorenz, who was essentially the father of chaos theory. Lorenz was a meteorologist, and he realized that there were certain systems which were assumed to be linear but weren't necessarily linear, so that you got unexpected outputs at the end of that system. And this was further built on by Ludwig von Bertalanffy, who was a biologist who developed general systems theory, and then Ilya Prigogine, with a famous book, who found the certitude in 1996. A lot of the modern thinking, however, on complexity has arisen out of this organization called the Santa Fe Institute. And this was set up in 1984. It was a multidisciplinary group involving people in the areas of physics, biology, psychology, computer science, mathematics, and economics. And it was set up by a chemist called George Cowan, and by famous physicist Murray Gell-Mann, who is best known for discovering and describing the quark, one of the basic fundamental particles. The Santa Fe Institute is still in place, and it still uses this multidisciplinary approach to look at complexity. And it has moved out of the physical sciences into the social sciences, which is its relevance to what I'm talking about today. And the Santa Fe Institute, in their mission or vision statement, state that their researchers endeavor to understand and unify the underlying shared patterns in complex physical, biological, social, cultural, technological, and even possible astrobiological worlds. So I'm just going to elucidate a little bit of basic systems theory. Again, I'm assuming some people may have an understanding of this, some may not. Donella Meadows, who has written a very famous book on systems theory, described a system as being a set of elements or parts that is coherently organized and interconnected in a pattern or structure that produces a characteristic set of behaviors, often classified as its function or its purpose. So essentially, a set is two entities which are not connected and don't interact. Once you have an interaction between them, then you produce a system. And that interaction is either through transfer of energy or information through those entities. And this is the very basic premise behind systems thinking. Now, there is a taxonomy of systems, and essentially the taxonomy varies between different authors, but essentially the system taxonomy that I kind of find most useful is to describe simple systems, complicated systems, and complex systems. So a simple system is a system in which you have a small number of entities with limited connections. And this is, as I was describing earlier, a linear system. So this is a system based on the mechanical paradigm. And that's demonstrated by that picture of a balance in which the input on one side has a direct output on the other side. A complicated system is a system with a large number of entities, but again, the interactions are linear and therefore are highly predictable. And so if you take the jet engine on the picture, that's a classic example of a complicated system. So there's many parts, those parts are interacting, but engineers can actually sit down and predict reasonably accurately how those parts will interact in a generally linear way. And then the area which is probably of most interest and concern to us here today are complex systems. And complex systems are generally divided into complex physical systems and complex adaptive systems. So in a complex system, you have a large number of entities, and the interaction between them is non-linear. And that's really what is the fundamental element of how complex systems work and what makes them different to other forms of systems. Complex physical system, essentially the entities that interact will interact in a non-deterministic way, and this is really the area of chaos theory. And so turbulent flow, for example, or fractal geometry and how a snowflake will form. When a snowflake forms, it's impossible to predict what way it's going to form, even though it is essentially deterministic. Chaos theory relies on the initial conditions. A slight variation in the initial conditions leads to a totally different outcome, and therefore makes it really difficult to predict. However, the area that we're most interested in are complex adaptive systems. And the key thing about complex adaptive systems is that not only do the entities interact, but they also adapt and they change their behavior. And that's what creates the really bright palette of complexity and complex systems. And there are a couple of examples of complex adaptive systems shown here. An ant colony is a classic example whereby ants interact with simple rules. They adapt their behavior depending on the environment in which they're in, and it creates quite genuine complexity. The immune system is another example of a complex adaptive system in which the components of the immune system adapt their behavior dependent on the situation that they're dealing with. Economies are another classic example of complex adaptive systems. And I suppose my thesis is that healthcare organizations, including hospitals, are also examples of complex adaptive systems. So essentially, as I said, a complex adaptive system is where the entities adapt their behavior and are constantly changing. Now, complexity science really has a number of goals. The first goal really is to use cross-disciplinary insights into complex systems. And that really is what makes the topic really exciting and really interesting, is bringing in techniques and ways of thinking into different disciplines and using them to further your understanding of these systems. And then perhaps more controversial is whether it's possible to develop a general theory of complexity. There are a number of disciplines that are involved in the study of complexity. The study of dynamics is about change in systems. Cybernetics is about controlling systems and the role of positive and negative feedback. Information science is about the study of representation and communication within systems. Computation is how systems actually use that information. And evolution is the study of how systems adapt. And there are a number of different methodologies that are used in complexity science. And these include real-world observation, both empirical and experimental, theoretical study, and computer simulation. So on the left-hand side here, you have a picture of an ecosystem, and this is one of the classic areas where observational and experimental methods are used in complexity science. This can also take place in economies, and my thesis is perhaps it is a part of quality improvement within the complex adaptive system of a healthcare organization. In the middle, we have mathematical modeling, and the main reason why I've shown this is that mathematical modeling can be used in complex systems, but it has to be non-linear, and it has to be based largely on non-normal distributions or non-Gaussian. And what you see in the middle diagram there, in fact, is the Pareto distribution, which is probably familiar to a lot of you involved in QI. And this is the distribution. It's a power law distribution, essentially, which reflects the fact that, other than the Pareto distribution as initially described, was that 80% of the wealth is held by 20% of the people. And one of the things that power law distributions mean in complex systems is that large unexpected events can sometimes happen. And then on the right-hand side is a software program called NetLogo, which is freely available and which can be used to model complex systems. And it has the capacity to be actually adapted and used. And this is a program that I'm just really dipping my toe in the water with, but it allows you basically to write programs which will allow you to potentially model in a simulated form how you may interact with a complex system. So complex adaptive systems. So the nature of complex adaptive systems really are related to the fact that they involve agents or entities, that these agents or entities are diverse. So they're not all the same, they're all different, they all behave differently. However, these agents also have to be connected to each other, and they also have to be interdependent, which means that the behavior or the action of one agent will potentially affect another agent. However, most important for adaptive systems is that these agents are adaptive. They can change their behavior depending on what's happening within the system. As a result of these components, there's a number of features that actually result within complex systems. Emergence, really, which is essentially the whole is greater than the individual parts. So if you take a complex adaptive system, you will find features that emerge from that system that can't be predicted by the individual components of that system. And the classic example in social science would be culture, for example. And again, this is a big feature of healthcare organizations, in that within healthcare organizations, culture can emerge from the different interactions of the agents, and you wouldn't necessarily be able to predict that emergent phenomenon from the individual components. Path dependence, which essentially means that as adaptive systems change, the history of the system is the point at which each change occurs, so that the history within a system is very important. and I'll allude to that with regards to healthcare organizations in a moment. Phase shifts means that systems can unexpectedly change. This is perhaps less of a feature of healthcare organizations, but I'll refer to that in a moment. Complex adaptive systems are resilient, so even though phase shifts can occur, depending on the nature of the system, a lot of potential resilience can be built into it. And complex adaptive systems are non-linear general, however, there may be small pockets of isolated linearity. Complex adaptive systems are also self-organizing. They tend to have a hierarchy. This is not a hierarchy in the traditional sense, but it's a hierarchy based on the fact that you, for example, if you take an economy, that's at one end of the hierarchy, and the individual people acting in that hierarchy, they're both complex systems, but there's a hierarchical element to them. Now, what about healthcare organizations as complex adaptive systems? Well, as you know, healthcare organizations are essentially people systems. So they do contain agents and entities. The agents and entities in a healthcare organization are diverse. We have multiple disciplines, we have multiple professions, and we also have other elements of diversity in terms of how people think, in terms of how they behave, and in terms of their belief systems. Within healthcare systems, nobody works in isolation, so everyone is connected and everyone is interdependent. Perhaps most important, however, from a quality improvement point of view, is that within a healthcare organization, largely these systems are adaptive. And that might be something that management structures might struggle with, but in fact, it's a fact of life with regards to healthcare organizations. So just to sort of break down healthcare organizations' complex systems, as I said, each healthcare organization may have a culture which emerges from the interactions of the agents. Path dependence usually means that it's not typically possible for us to break down an organization and rebuild it from scratch. So as our healthcare organizations develop, they're developing based on their history. So that's path dependence based on the fact that each shift in the state of an organization is based on where it was previously. Phase shifts are possible, but they're generally quite rare, and there are a number of constraints that are built into healthcare organizations that make phase shifts less likely to occur. They are resilient, and that is certainly something that people who try to manage change within healthcare organizations find. Some of the resilience is based on the fact that the agents in a healthcare organization largely have a common goal, which is about providing healthcare. However, there's also a potential for groupthink in which we surround ourselves, or organizations are generally people who are stuck within a dominant logic, and this can make the system quite resilient to change. Adaptive systems are largely non-linear. However, there may be pockets of isolated linearity, and that's something that's important to recognize and to notice in terms of interacting with that system. However, this also creates an assumed causality, and sometimes there's an assumption that a decision or an action you take, that you determine or you see a result of that which you assume is directly related to that decision. However, in fact, it may in fact be the result of complex interaction. A self-organization can also occur. This is limited a little bit based on the way healthcare organizations function. However, there is a little bit of non-apparent self-organization, and certainly there is a certain self-organization within professional groups. And then, likewise, healthcare organizations tend to have a hierarchy and scaling, from small clinical teams to professional groupings within hospitals, to directorates, to hospitals, to groups, to the wider healthcare organization. So what's the issue with regards to quality improvement and complex adaptive systems? Well, any quality improvement intervention really requires interference with the system. Also, effective quality improvement perhaps should try to utilize the diversity within the system. The role of connections is also very important, and interdependence and recognizing non-linearity. And then perhaps the most difficult area is managing the adaptation that might take place in the system. So to interfere with a system, that requires a knowledge of the system's current state, and it requires a knowledge of the changes within the system. And this is a problem with the traditional command and control hierarchical system. And the problems really relate to four factors: information bandwidth, unpredictability, non-linearity, and the adaptiveness of the agent. I just say a little, sort of a few words regarding that. So if you have a traditional hierarchy, it's reasonably okay for information flow in terms of sending information from the top down to the bottom, but it's less effective for information flow from the bottom up to the top. And if you look at the complexity of a system, then if you have one commander and controller, they do not have the mental capacity or the capacity to deal with the information in a way that they can have a proper effective control down at the bottom of the hierarchy. Also, based on the hierarchy and the non-linearity is the difficulty in predicting what decisions or actions are taken at the top of the hierarchy will actually have down the bottom. This sometimes creates an illusion of control, whereby one assumes a linear mechanistic causality, whereas in fact what happens down at the bottom of the hierarchy may have absolutely nothing to do with what decision was taken up at the top. And obviously this is all influenced by the fact that within a healthcare organization, down at the bottom of the hierarchy, we have adaptive agents. And there's very good reasons why agents should be adaptive in a healthcare organization, but it kind of flies in the face of the traditional top-down management paradigm. So there are some systems in which a hierarchical system does work, and that's the traditional army structure. And the reason why it works in the army structure is that the agents down at the bottom of the hierarchy have very few degrees of freedom. So part of military training is to ingrain within the frontline troops that they follow commands, and they follow commands as they're stated. And this creates more of a linearity within the system, whereby someone at the top of the organization, if they send a command down through the organization, they know that it will get to the bottom of the hierarchy with very little adaptation around it. Interesting, however, even within military circles, there's been some changes in thinking regarding this. This gentleman here is General Stanley McChrystal, who was former head of the Joint Special Operations Command in the United States. And he came from a traditional army hierarchy, but he realized that in the changing complex worlds that we live in, particularly related to terrorism and terrorist cells, that there was a need to change the management paradigm. And he basically came up with the concept of allowing the frontline troops to be more adaptive to the mission. And as he said, eyes on, hands off. And he uses the term of a gardening approach to leadership. And I think this is a really useful model to use with regards to complex systems. So to me, gardening in complex systems is about constantly monitoring the system, tending and reacting appropriately to the changes in the system, allowing a certain amount of natural development, and creating the environment within which the system acts. However, to do that, you need to be within the system, and this is really where a hierarchical management system potentially fails. And McChrystal used this term battlefield circulation, which really involves him regularly visiting the frontline troops. And I suppose this is reflected in the area of managerial walk-rounds, which I know have been rolled out and pioneered by the QI division here. And McChrystal said the battlefield circulation essentially increased understanding of the situation, allowed direct communication to the forces, and obviously leading and inspiring directly. Now, what about using diversity? Well, diversity is very important in managing complex systems, and I believe in rolling out quality improvement interventions. And diversity is really about using teams, because teams generate the diversity. This allows multiple knowledge domains to be utilized in the interventions. It prevents groupthink, and it allows, perhaps more importantly, for cognitive diversity, which is different people from different disciplines think differently. Most people in healthcare have a sort of a dominant logic, and there is a value to bringing in non-healthcare people to help with regards to quality improvement teams. The next area in which using complexity science can have a role in quality improvement in health organizations is an understanding of networks, and this is really related to the connection and the interdependencies within systems. And so there's an example of 3 networks here. Random networks, which are largely mathematical models and really don't have a very large place in the real world. And then these 2 other networks, scale-free and small world. Scale-free networks are dominated by power laws. They are an element of certain complex adaptive systems. The internet is a classic example. And in a scale-free network, you have preferential attachment to various nodes in the network. So a lot of the nodes have very few connections, and you have a small number that have a large number of connections. The small world network, however, probably is a better reflection of what happens in healthcare organizations. And in the small world networks, you have small groups that have some interconnection with other groups, but most of their connections are within their own group. And this has a relevance, which I'll discuss next. So this is related to using networks to diffuse ideas and quality improvement exercise within an organization. And essentially, there's a very interesting recent study done from the University of Pennsylvania, looked at this experimentally. And they found that on the left-hand side, you have a well-connected network, a very well-connected network. This, in fact, is not as good as you might think for diffusion of ideas. On the right-hand side, you have a sparsely connected network. So if you introduce an idea into this network, it's very difficult for it to spread to the different groupings within the network. In the middle, you have a mixture of both. And this was counterintuitive. And this is really how ideas would appear to spread best. And essentially what it means is it increases the chance that ideas or information or changes will move from one component of the network to the other. However, by having large interconnections within each of these components of the network, that allows that idea or that concept or that project to actually bed down so that there is mutual support within that area. So it seems without realizing it that perhaps this is an opportunity that can be really capitalized on the small world networks within healthcare organizations. So it's very important to identify the networks, understand the connections, build relations within these connections, and to identify individuals with high influence within these groups. Linearity and non-linearity, as I said, complex adaptive systems are largely non-linear, which means that they're unpredictable, and because of that, you need to build in some slack into the system. In other words, you don't want to introduce any irreversible changes because the effect of those changes will be unpredictable. Experimentation is a vital part of interfering with complex adaptive systems in terms of introducing changes, and likewise measurements, so measuring the effect of your experimentation. And realistically, this is something that the quality improvement movement has figured out a long time ago. And really, this is the fundamental element of PDSA cycles, in which you do experimentation within the system, and you determine the change, and that gives you the option to either iterate your cycles until you have the desired result. Managing adaptation, which is probably the most challenging part of quality improvement within a complex adaptive system. And really, this is a combination of psychology, understanding the agent's personal motivations, having influence, and I suppose in recent times, this is where the concept of frontline ownership has come in. And obviously, people have different personal motivations, and I think if you want to have an impact within a complex adaptive system, you need to understand these motives. And then likewise, you need to influence these motives, and there are a number of useful, well-scientifically proven ways of doing that, and these are a number of factors that have been described by a chap called Bob Cialdini in a very good book called Influence. And then, of course, frontline ownership, which certainly appears, and I know that Michael Gardan has certainly shown can be a big part by allowing the frontline staff to own the quality improvement actions. You're more likely to have them involved, and it makes them less likely to adapt to the changes that have been introduced. And in fact, Denning, who kind of wrote a number of his books really in advance of a lot of the writings on complex adaptive systems, intuitively realized these things with regards to his areas of profound knowledge. So finally, what about the UHW experience? Well, the experiment is still ongoing. I do use complexity thinking with regards to what we're doing. I suppose we have, after a failed attempt at introducing the theatre productive operating system a number of years ago, managed to establish it this time and maintain it now almost 18 months after we introduced it, and it's still quite active there. And we're also now trying to approach a twin-track approach to quality improvement within the wider hospital and development strategy. And again, I'm using complexity thinking to influence that. However, being complex, the endpoint is unpredictable. So maybe I'll come back in a year or two and let you know how that has really gone. So in summary, complexity is a worldview. It does have a scientific basis. It pervades healthcare. It cannot be controlled, but it can be harnessed. And an understanding of complex systems, as one of the theoreticians in complexity science in America, Scott Page, says, let you going from poking the tiger to taming the lion. And complexity does need to be considered if you're planning to make changes within organizations. And therefore, complexity should inform QI interventions. So because I know these slides have been archived, I have just given a number of resources that I have found very worthwhile in understanding complex systems. The ones that have the red border, I would highly recommend. Some of these are highly technical, some are less so. Some are designed for a general audience, but they're very useful resources for understanding complexity. There's a number of very good video resources out there, and I certainly would recommend Complexity Academy, which is more general, and Complexity Explorer, which has a number of quite technical videos, but very useful videos. And then a number of other websites related to complexity. And then people should maybe consider NetLogo, which is a modeling software program which is available free on the internet and can be quite useful in looking at complex systems and how they might behave. So with that, thank you.
Perfect. This is Roisin here from behind the webcam. We've got Crowley here joining us as well. And so thanks a million, David. I'm sure that's spurred a lot of people into thinking around complex adaptive systems and how they might integrate some of that thinking into their workspace. So there has been quite a few comments in the chat box function, and some people, Rob Honey actually had asked about hands-on experience of how complex adaptive systems work in healthcare settings. How do you wean people from the command and control paradigm? Interesting. Yes,
that will be my next project. The revolution starts here.
Yeah.
I think trying to break out of the groupthink. There's a lot of groupthink about how things have traditionally worked within healthcare, and I think it's quite obvious that pervading command and control paradigm hasn't really worked. But I think you can try and change a system from the bottom up, but it'll be quite slow, and you'll be waiting for phase shifts. So I think it'll probably require a number of people higher up the hierarchy to get the message. In terms of hands-on knowledge, well, a lot of the components that have been recently sort of that the QI movement is utilizing, as I said, like the PDSA cycles and the Deming's profound knowledge, you know, is an acknowledgement that people find that these approaches do work within complex adaptive systems. So, in a sense, they actually acknowledge the fact that healthcare systems are complex adaptive systems.
Yeah, great. And Paula Kavanagh and others were talking with reference to your gardening analogy. And I suppose they're just saying that they wish other healthcare managers would get down and dirty and get in the muck, I suppose, with the healthcare staff. And just, you know, how it's interesting that biological models for complexity in science, like the gardening analogy, that we can frequently, you know, we can fall into that language, and people who use it often do. And Rob Honey actually mentioned, would it be interesting to get all HSC staff to do some gardening?
Well, I mean, all models are essentially metaphors. So models are useful metaphors. So I think metaphors do have a role in telling the story and describing the system or how complexity works.
It's interesting, Rob's comments about, and also what you're saying about, I suppose, the illusion of control. I mean, I guess being on the national directors of the HSE, I would argue that we still operate a little bit under that illusion, that in some way we sit here and we have some kind of control over what goes on a ward in your hospital on a given day. It's a terrible illusion to labour under, because what it leads to, obviously, and I've felt personally at times, is a situation where people have expectations of that, and they kind of say, what were you doing on that day? How did that happen on your watch? So I think this couldn't be more pertinent to where we're at. And
I suppose perhaps putting my head on the block, one of the things that I found is a lot of the work around patient flow falls into that trap, whereby you have actions that are taken centrally based on aggregate numbers. So they take the trolley count as an aggregate number. If you take an aggregate number, you lose a lot of information of what's actually going on in the system. Now, if you take actions based on that aggregate number, and then you see an effect down at the front line, you may go under the assumption that your action at the top has created that. Because in fact, in my experience, most patient flow isn't actually based on large-scale aggregate actions based on aggregate numbers. It's the individual plans that are put in place down on the ground for the individual patients that are stuck in the flow. And it's not that there's any one particular issue that is leading to the flow problems. It's actually multiple issues down at the front line. And this is the classic example of complexity. So I think it's easy to fall into the trap that think that if there's a plan to institute some action nationally and roll it out, and then if you get results down at the front line, then you assume there's a direct causality between the two, when in fact, frequently that's not the case.
I think the other thing we do nationally, and I've spoken a little bit about how we do or do we not do constant monitoring, as you described there when you described gardening. We do have monthly performance reports, but again, as you rightly point out, largely deal with aggregate data, which mixture of the good and the bad, really averaging out into some kind of a number that is rendered relatively meaningless, because you don't really see, you're not really monitoring at a granular enough level where patients are actually being looked after. So what you end up doing, of course, is you tamper. In other words, you start acting on things that don't need to be acted on, and so we're working to improve that. I mean, we need to improve that.
I think from personal experience, the classic example of that was around the productive operating theatre. So we had our first attempt at introducing that in Waterford about 4 years ago, and basically it was that sort of top-down approach whereby this was what the productive operating theatre was about. It was handed to us as a hospital, and we were said, get on with it. And it failed miserably for a number of different reasons, which I've spoken about on another occasion, and I won't go into here. The second time around, however, was different, because what happened was we became a focus site, which meant that a number of people from the National Clinical Programs in Surgery and Anesthesia came down to the hospital. They embedded themselves in the hospital over a period of time, and they were able to do that on-the-ground gardening. So they were able to tend, they were able to see what was going on, they were able to react to the system as it actually happened. And we've had much more success really as a result of that approach. And I think this is really important. If you really want to be successful with a change within an organization, you almost need to be on the ground within the organization to do that.
And that links in nicely to some of the other comments around, I suppose, quality improvement methods that you might hinge on the thinking of complex data systems. And Rob had mentioned frontline ownership techniques and how it seems that other QI, I suppose, concepts as well as frontline ownership and related complexity concepts instinctively start to use biological terms like growth, planting, nurturing. It's quite similar, really. And I suppose the question being, what other quality improvement techniques, other than frontline ownership, would you think would link in nicely with complexity?
Well, as I said, because of non-linearity, experimentation, I think, is really important, and keeping that slack in the system. So, and this is the whole concept of small tests rather than large changes, in which you can't actually predict what the input or the output of that will be. And therefore, I think it's very important that you create some slack for either rolling back, and if you find that that change isn't working, to be kind of magnanimous enough to say, okay, we tried that, it didn't work, let's move on to the next thing. And PDSAs obviously do that at a small level, but there is sometimes a change within the health service that we do at a very large scale level. A reorganization of hospitals, for example, without really knowing what the impact of that is going to be.
Okay, unless there's any final comments actually from Philip, we might.
Well, I maybe just by way of final comments, thank David very much for doing the webinar and dealing with such a kind of a important, tricky but completely relevant issue. It chimes a lot. You know, I wouldn't have put it in any way as eloquently as you have done, or with the kind of research background that you brought to bear on this. But essentially, that's the kind of dialogue we're having nationally, and obviously in trying to break up the HSE and establish organisations at a more local level. Hopefully, we will achieve not the setting up of mini HSEs, which in their turn try to command and control, but actually understand that ultimately at the front line that the knowledge lies.
Okay, great. And just in finishing off then, as you know, we have a web page and you can follow us on QI Talk Time. The recording of this webinar will be up hopefully within the next week, 10 days. Our next webinar, hopefully you can all join us, is on the 9th of May, and it will be on measurement for improvement. And we have colleagues from the quality improvement team here in Dr. Stevens who are going to talk to us specifically on measurement. So that's all for now. So thank you very much for joining in. There's the 2 email addresses. And I know somebody did ask for the link to the biologist talk on complexity systems that you mentioned in your talk. So what we can do is we can put that up in the slides. We'll embed it into the slide set.
Yeah, and I can add some more links to the number of, interesting papers related to that whole area.
Perfect. Okay, great. Thanks very much.